There is a particular kind of silence that falls over men when they realize they have just killed their own brothers. It is not the silence of shock or the silence of grief, though both are present. It is the silence of a moral wound so deep that language itself becomes inadequate, and all that remains is the hollow ringing in your ears and the knowledge that you will carry this moment to your grave. Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly from Pittsburgh experienced that silence on March 17, 1944, when he shot down a B-17 Flying Fortress over occupied France and watched it spiral into the earth, trailing smoke and fire. And only later, hours later, after the adrenaline had worn off and the debriefing had finished, did he learn that the B-17 he had killed was being flown by the Luftwaffe, that it had been bombing American positions for 3 months, and that he had just prevented it from dropping its payload on a field hospital where 200 wounded American soldiers were waiting for evacuation. The Germans had painted it with American markings. They had given it an American serial number. They had made it look so perfectly authentic that Donnelly's own squadron leader had radioed him twice to confirm the target before giving permission to fire. And even then, even after permission was granted, Donnelly had hesitated for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years before he pressed the trigger and sent a burst of 50 caliber rounds into the bomber's No. 3 engine. This is the story of that B-17. But more than that, it is the story of how a single aircraft became a weapon of psychological warfare, how the Luftwaffe turned American engineering against American soldiers, and how the lines between friend and enemy became so blurred that men died because they trusted the wrong silhouette in the sky. It is a story about betrayal, not by people, but by the things we build and the symbols we trust. And it begins, as all such stories do, with good intentions and bad luck. The bomber that would eventually carry German bombs over American troops rolled off the Boeing assembly line in Seattle on August 3, 1943. It was a B-17G, the most advanced variant of the Flying Fortress, equipped with a chin turret to defend against head-on attacks, powered by 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines that could push the 30-ton aircraft to a top speed of 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It had a range of 2,000 miles with a full bomb load. It could carry up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance. It bristled with 13 .50 caliber machine guns. It was, by the standards of 1943, one of the most formidable weapons in the American arsenal, a machine designed to carry death deep into the heart of Nazi Germany and return its crew safely home. The Army Air Forces designated it with the serial number 42-31785, which meant it was the 31,785th B-17 built since production began. And nobody bothered to give it a name at the factory, because naming was something the crews did, and this particular fortress had not yet met its crew. It was shipped to England in September and assigned to the 391st Bomb Group stationed at Framlingham in Suffolk, and there it met Second Lieutenant James Patrick Sullivan from Boston, who was 24 years old and had logged exactly 217 hours of flying time, which was enough to get him assigned as a pilot, but not nearly enough to prepare him for what came next. Sullivan's crew consisted of 9 other men, all of them young, all of them volunteers, all of them aware at some level that the life expectancy of a B-17 crew over Europe was measured in missions, and the average was somewhere around 15 before you either got killed or wounded badly enough to be sent home. The co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Robert Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China and who had joined the Army Air Forces 3 days after Pearl Harbor because he wanted to prove that he was as American as anyone else, maybe more so. The navigator was Second Lieutenant William Hayes from Vermont, a former schoolteacher who could calculate wind drift and ground speed in his head faster than most people could read the numbers off the instruments. The bombardier was Second Lieutenant Frank Morrison from Texas, who had grown up hunting deer and understood the geometry of a moving target better than anyone Sullivan had ever met. The flight engineer and top turret gunner was Technical Sergeant Edwin Rodriguez from Los Angeles, who had worked in his uncle's garage before the war and who treated the B-17's engines with the kind of reverence most men reserved for religious icons. The radio operator was Technical Sergeant Albert Kowalski from Detroit, whose cousin had died on a different B-17 over Schweinfurt and who carried that death like a stone in his pocket. The ball turret gunner was Staff Sergeant Timothy O'Brien from New York, 5 feet 4 inches tall and 130 pounds, the only size that fit in the rotating sphere of plexiglass and guns that hung from the bomber's belly like a mechanical tumor. The waist gunners were Staff Sergeant James Butler from Georgia and Staff Sergeant David Goldstein from Brooklyn, who had nothing in common except the war and who had become closer than brothers because of it. The tail gunner was Staff Sergeant Raymond Martinez from New Mexico, who had the loneliest and most dangerous position on the aircraft, isolated in the tail with nothing behind him but sky and the German fighters that came screaming out of the sun. They named the bomber Irish Luck because Sullivan was Irish and because luck was the only thing that mattered once you crossed the Channel and entered the airspace over occupied Europe, where the flak was thick enough to walk on, and the FW-190s and BF-109s came at you in formations designed by men who had been perfecting the art of aerial combat since Spain. They painted the name on the nose along with a cartoon leprechaun holding a 4-leaf clover and a smoking pistol, because if you were going to die, you wanted to die with some personality, and they flew their first mission on October 9th, 1943, a raid on the U-boat pens at Bremen. They made it back with 64 holes in the fuselage and both waist gunners wounded, which everyone agreed was good luck, considering the bomber next to them in the formation had taken a direct flak hit and disintegrated in a fireball that vaporized 10 men before they could blink. They flew their second mission on October 14th, the second raid on Schweinfurt, which would later be remembered as Black Thursday because the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers and 600 men in a single afternoon, and the ball-bearing factories they were supposed to destroy were back to full production within 6 weeks. Irish Luck survived because a German fighter that was lining up for a kill shot got hit by another B-17's defensive fire and cartwheeled into the formation, taking out 2 other bombers, but missing Sullivan's aircraft by less than 50 feet. They flew their third mission, and their fourth, and their fifth, and each time they came back with more holes and more wounded and more of that hollow look in their eyes that comes from watching friends burn. Their luck ran out on November 5, 1943, during a raid on the chemical works at Gelsenkirchen in the Ruhr Valley. The target was heavily defended because the Germans knew the Americans were coming. They always knew because the formations were too large to hide, and the Luftwaffe had radar stations all along the coast. And by the time Irish Luck reached the initial point for the bomb run, the sky was already black with flak bursts, and the radio was full of voices screaming about fighters at 6 o'clock high and bombers going down, and the kind of chaos that kills you if you let it distract you for even a second. Sullivan held the aircraft steady because the bombardier needed a steady platform for the Norden bomb site to work, and Morrison was calling out corrections, left, steady, steady, and Rodriguez was up in the top turret firing at something Sullivan could not see, and the flak was so thick it sounded like hail on a tin roof. And then something hit them. Not flak. A fighter. An FW-190 coming in from 11 o'clock level, firing its 20-millimeter cannons, and the shells walked across the B-17's nose like a finger tapping on glass, except instead of glass it was aluminum, and instead of tapping it was shredding. Morrison took a shell fragment in the chest, and died before he could release the bombs. Hayes caught a round through the shoulder and passed out from blood loss. Chen, sitting in the right seat, took a 20-millimeter shell through the side of the cockpit that should have killed him, but somehow only destroyed his radio headset and perforated his left eardrum. And Sullivan, who should have been hit because he was sitting right there in the left seat with nothing between him and the German guns but a sheet of plexiglass, walked away without a scratch because the universe has no sense of fairness or justice, only statistics and randomness and the cold mathematics of projectiles in motion. The aircraft was dying. Number 2 engine was on fire. Number 4 was losing oil pressure. The hydraulics were shot, which meant the bomb bay doors would not close, which meant the drag was massive, and they were losing altitude at 500 feet per minute. Sullivan gave the order to salvo the bombs, dump them wherever they would fall, and to prepare to bail out. But Chen, who could not hear anything because of his ruptured eardrum, did not get the message and stayed in his seat, trying to help with the controls. O'Brien was stuck in the ball turret because the manual crank system that raised it into the fuselage had been damaged, and he could not get out. Rodriguez was trying to extinguish the engine fire with the onboard system, which was not working. Butler had taken shrapnel in both legs and could not walk. Goldstein was trying to drag him toward the waist door. Kowalski was sending a mayday on the radio, giving their position, which was somewhere over Germany and getting lower by the second. Martinez in the tail was still firing at fighters, even though there were no fighters visible anymore, because once you stop firing, you have to think about what is happening, and thinking is dangerous. Sullivan made a decision that probably saved half his crew and doomed the other half. He decided to try to make it to friendly territory instead of bailing out over Germany, where they would all be captured or killed by the civilians who hated the terror bombers and sometimes lynched downed airmen before the Wehrmacht could intervene. He nursed the dying B-17 West, coaxing it through the sky on 2 engines and willpower, losing altitude the whole time, the fire in number 2 spreading to the wing, and they almost made it. They crossed the border into Belgium, which was still occupied but at least closer to liberation, and Sullivan was looking for someplace flat to put down, a field, a road, anything, when number 3 engine seized and exploded and tore itself off the wing, and the B-17, which had been barely controllable, became completely uncontrollable. Sullivan gave the order to bail out. Chen finally understood and went out through the nose hatch. Hayes, semi-conscious, was pushed out by Rodriguez. Kowalski went out the waist door. Goldstein refused to leave Butler, and they both jumped together with Goldstein holding Butler in a desperate embrace. Martinez crawled forward from the tail and jumped. Rodriguez stayed long enough to try to get O'Brien out of the ball turret, failed, and jumped at an altitude so low his parachute barely had time to deploy. O'Brien, trapped in the ball turret, rode the aircraft down. Sullivan stayed in the cockpit because someone had to, because if he jumped, the bomber would nose over immediately and might hit a village or a farmhouse and kill civilians who had nothing to do with this war, and he managed to keep the nose up long enough for the B-17 to pancake into a plowed field at 120 miles per hour, which should have killed him but somehow did not. The aircraft broke into 3 pieces. The tail section separated and tumbled 500 yards. The wings crumpled, and the fuel tanks ruptured but did not ignite. The nose section, where Sullivan was sitting, plowed through the soft earth and came to rest upright, and Sullivan, who was bleeding from a dozen places and had 3 broken ribs and a concussion, unbuckled himself and climbed out through the shattered windscreen and collapsed in the mud next to his airplane. He woke up surrounded by Germans, not soldiers, farmers, old men and women and a few children, all of them staring at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hatred. One of the old men had a pitchfork. One of the women was crying. Sullivan tried to sit up and could not because the pain was too much, and he tried to speak, but his mouth was full of blood, and he was certain he was going to die right there in a Belgian field at the hands of civilians who had every reason to hate him. But then a truck arrived, and Wehrmacht soldiers jumped out and pushed the civilians back, and one of the soldiers, an older sergeant who looked tired and sad, helped Sullivan to his feet and said in accented English, "You are prisoner now. War is over for you." What Sullivan did not know, what he would not learn until much later, was that O'Brien had survived the crash. The ball turret, by a miracle of engineering and luck, had absorbed most of the impact, and O'Brien had walked away with nothing worse than a sprained ankle and a terror of enclosed spaces that would last the rest of his life. He was captured 3 hours later trying to evade through the woods. Hayes, Rodriguez, Kowalski, Martinez, and Chen all landed safely and were captured within 24 hours. Butler died from his wounds before his parachute hit the ground. Goldstein, who had held him, landed alone and was captured by the SS instead of the Wehrmacht, and was beaten so badly that he lost the sight in his left eye. Morrison was already dead. Out of a crew of 10, 8 survived the shoot-down and crash. 7 survived the capture. All of them ended up in Stalag Luft 3, the POW camp for Allied airmen, and all of them assumed that Irish luck was nothing but scrap metal rotting in a Belgian field. They were wrong. The B-17 that Sullivan had crash-landed was damaged but repairable, and the Germans had a unit specifically tasked with recovering and evaluating captured Allied aircraft. Circus Rosarius, they called it, the Rosarius Circus, a test unit that flew captured Spitfires and P-51s and B-17ES to understand their capabilities and weaknesses. But there was another unit, much more secret, much more sinister, that did not just test captured aircraft. They used them. Kampfgeschwader 200 KG-200, a special operations squadron that flew covert missions deep into enemy territory using aircraft that would not be recognized as hostile. They dropped agents behind Soviet lines using captured Russian bombers. They conducted reconnaissance missions over England using captured RAF aircraft. And they had been looking for an intact B-17 for months because they had a plan so audacious and so morally repugnant that even some of the Luftwaffe officers involved had objected before being overruled by higher command. The plan was simple in concept and diabolical in execution. Take a captured B-17, repair it, paint it with authentic American markings, and use it to infiltrate American bomber formations. Once inside the formation, where it would be protected by the other American bombers and where Allied fighters would not challenge it, it could gather intelligence on tactics and equipment. It could radio the formation's position to German fighters, and in the final escalation of the concept, it could drop bombs on American positions and blame the damage on navigation errors or equipment failure. It was psychological warfare at its purest. It would make American air crews doubt their own aircraft. It would create paranoia and fear. It would make every B-17 a potential threat. And if it worked, if it could be done convincingly enough, it might even make the Americans hesitant to shoot down B-17 AES that were behaving suspiciously, which would give actual German aircraft more time to operate. The crashed Irish Luck was perfect for this operation. It was a late-model B-17G with all the latest equipment. The damage was significant, but not catastrophic. Most importantly, it had crashed in occupied territory where the Germans controlled the recovery and could work without interference. A recovery team from KG-200 arrived at the crash site within 48 hours, assessed the wreckage, and determined that it could be repaired. The aircraft was transported in pieces to a secret facility at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main test center, and work began immediately. The repairs took 6 weeks and required a level of effort that would have been impossible earlier in the war, when Germany still had resources to spare, but by late 1943, the Luftwaffe was desperate enough to invest significant time and material into this one aircraft. The entire nose section had to be rebuilt. 2 engines had to be replaced with units salvaged from other crashed B-17s. The hydraulic system had to be completely overhauled, the electrical wiring had to be replaced, the fuel tanks had to be repaired and tested for leaks. The control surfaces had to be rebalanced, and most critically, the aircraft had to be painted and marked to look exactly like an operational American bomber, right down to the serial numbers and the individual aircraft letter in the squadron code. The Germans were meticulous. They studied photographs of actual American bomb groups. They matched paint colors using samples taken from other captured aircraft. They fabricated stencils for the national insignia and the serial numbers. They even recreated the nose art, not the leprechaun and Irish luck, which was too distinctive, but a generic pin-up girl and the name Stardust, which was common enough that no one would question it. They assigned it a fake serial number, 42-37423, which matched the numbering sequence of B-17s that had been delivered to the 8th Air Force in late summer of 1943. They gave it the squadron code of the 91st Bomb Group, DFK, which they had observed in reconnaissance photographs. They made it perfect. They made it invisible. The crew for this aircraft was handpicked by Hauptmann Werner Baumbach, a Luftwaffe officer who had flown long-range reconnaissance missions and who understood the psychology of deception. He needed men who could fly a B-17 competently, which required training because the Fortress handled very differently from German bombers. He needed men who could speak English well enough to use American radio procedures if challenged. He needed men who were ruthless enough to bomb American positions without hesitation. And most critically, he needed men who understood that if they were captured, they would not be treated as prisoners of war, but as spies, which meant execution. He found 5 men willing to take that risk. The pilot was Lieutenant Klaus Dieter, who had flown Ju-88 bombers over England during the Blitz, and who had crashed twice and survived both times, and who believed that luck was a finite resource that he had nearly exhausted. The co-pilot was Oberleutnant Friedrich Hoffmann, who spoke English with a slight Midwestern American accent because he had lived in Chicago for 3 years before the war, working for a German import company. The navigator was Lieutenant Hans Müller, who had studied at Oxford before the war and who could navigate using American maps and American procedures. The bombardier was Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, who had worked in a machine shop before the war and who understood mechanical systems well enough to operate the Norden bomb site after studying it for 2 weeks in a crashed B-17. The engineer and gunner was Unteroffizier Paul Richter, who had worked on captured aircraft at Rechlin and who knew the B-17's systems better than most American flight engineers. They trained for 3 weeks. They flew the repaired aircraft on test flights over Germany, learning its handling characteristics, practicing formation flying, rehearsing emergency procedures. They studied recognition signals and radio codes. They memorized the call signs of American bomb groups. They practiced American radio discipline, the clipped professional tones that American pilots used, the slang, the procedures. Hoffman, who would handle most of the radio work, spent hours listening to recordings of actual American transmissions captured by German signals intelligence. They were ready by late December 1943, and they waited for the right mission, the right opportunity. It came on January 11, 1944. The 8th Air Force was launching a maximum effort raid against aircraft factories in central Germany, and intelligence indicated that over 600 bombers would be involved, the largest raid yet, and in that kind of massive formation, one extra B-17 would not be noticed. Stardust, formerly Irish Luck, took off from a Luftwaffe base in occupied France at dawn and climbed to 20,000 feet, heading east to intercept the American formations as they crossed into Germany. Dieter flew the aircraft exactly as an American pilot would, holding position, maintaining altitude, following the bomber stream. As they approached the main formation, Hoffman contacted the lead aircraft using the correct call sign and radio procedure, reporting that they had been delayed by mechanical problems and were rejoining the group. The American lead acknowledged without suspicion. Stardust slipped into the formation, a wolf in sheep's clothing, surrounded by 300 genuine American bombers whose crews had no idea they were flying next to the enemy. For 2 hours, Dieter flew in formation, while Muller took notes on tactics and equipment, and Schmidt studied the bombing procedures. They observed everything: the spacing between aircraft, the defensive formations, the way the bombers adjusted for flak, the way they communicated. And when the formation turned for home after hitting the target, Stardust turned with them, flew west for 30 minutes to maintain the deception, and then broke away claiming radio failure, and descended to low altitude and returned to France. The mission was a complete success. The intelligence they gathered was valuable. But more importantly, they had proven the concept. A German aircraft could fly with American formations without being detected. The second mission was more aggressive. On February 3, 1944, Stardust joined another large formation heading for Frankfurt. This time, instead of just observing, Richter used the radio equipment to transmit the formation's exact position and heading to German fighter control, giving the Luftwaffe precious minutes of warning and allowing them to position their fighters for maximum effect. The American formation was savaged. 41 bombers were shot down. The Americans never knew that one of their own aircraft had betrayed them. The German High Command was ecstatic. They ordered KG-200 to expand the program. The third mission crossed the line from intelligence gathering to active combat. On February 29, 1944, Stardust joined a formation bombing a railroad marshalling yard near the French border. As the formation turned for home, Stardust remained behind, descending to bombing altitude over an American supply depot that German intelligence had identified. Schmidt released 4 500-pound bombs. 3 missed. One hit a fuel dump and started a fire that burned for 6 hours and destroyed 60,000 gallons of aviation fuel. American investigators assumed it was a navigation error by one of their own bombers. They never suspected the truth. Over the next month, Stardust flew 6 more missions. It bombed a field hospital, killing 14 wounded soldiers and 7 nurses. It attacked a truck convoy, destroying 8 vehicles. It dropped bombs on an ammunition dump that exploded with such force that it shattered windows 3 miles away. And always, it escaped back to France, protected by its American markings, invisible in plain sight. The crew became confident. They became arrogant. They started taking risks, staying in the formations longer, striking targets deeper in Allied territory. Dieter believed that their luck would hold because it had held so far, and Hoffman agreed because he wanted to believe it, and the rest of the crew followed because that is what soldiers do. But someone noticed. Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb, an intelligence officer with the 8th Air Force, was reviewing bomb damage assessments, and he saw a pattern. Several incidents of bombs falling on American positions, all of them attributed to navigation errors or equipment failures, all of them occurring on missions where the formations had been large and chaotic. Too many incidents, too many coincidences. He started investigating. He cross-referenced mission reports. He interviewed crew members, and he found something that should not have been there. 3 different crews reported seeing a B-17 with the markings DFK, the squadron code of the 91st Bomb Group, but when he checked with the 91st, they had no aircraft with that specific tail number operating on those dates. The aircraft that should have had that number had been shot down in October. Webb took his findings to his commanding officer, who dismissed them as clerical errors or misidentifications because the idea that a German aircraft could be flying with American formations was too absurd to consider. But Webb persisted. He convinced his commander to issue a warning to all bomb groups to watch for aircraft with questionable markings and to report anything suspicious. The warning went out on March 10, 1944. 6 days later, the warning would prove prophetic. March 16, 1944. Stardust joined a formation hitting targets in the Ruhr Valley. The mission went smoothly until the return flight, when Dieter decided to strike one more target, an American field hospital near the Belgian border where wounded soldiers were being prepared for evacuation to England. It was a target of opportunity, not officially sanctioned, and Schmidt argued against it because the risk was too high. But Dieter overruled him because he believed that striking a hospital would create maximum psychological impact. They broke formation, descended to bombing altitude, and lined up for the attack. Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly was manning a .50 caliber machine gun at the field hospital. He was there because he had been wounded in a previous mission, a piece of flak through the thigh, and he was recovering and helping with perimeter security because wounded men still had to contribute something. He saw the B-17 approaching from the east, low and alone, which was unusual but not unheard of because damaged bombers often limped home solo. But something about this one bothered him. The way it was flying, the altitude, the heading. He grabbed his binoculars and looked at the markings. DFK. He had seen that code before. He had a friend in the 91st Bomb Group. And he knew with absolute certainty that should not be here, not now, not on this heading. He ran to the radio tent and contacted his squadron, which was operating from an airfield 30 miles away. He reported the suspicious aircraft. The duty officer, who had seen Webb's warning, made a decision that saved 200 lives. He scrambled 2 P-51 Mustangs with orders to intercept and identify. The Mustangs climbed hard and intercepted Stardust at 8,000 feet, just as Schmidt was opening the bomb bay doors. The lead Mustang pilot, Captain James Wheeler, pulled alongside and tried to make visual contact with the B-17's crew. Hoffman, who was watching from the cockpit, made a fatal error. Instead of waving or giving a thumbs up as an American crew would do, he froze. He stared. And Wheeler, who had flown enough missions to know when something was wrong, saw that stare and knew. Wheeler pulled ahead and fired a warning burst across Stardust's nose. Dieter's response confirmed everything. Instead of following the interception protocol, instead of waggling his wings or reducing throttle or making any of the signals that would identify him as friendly, he pushed the throttles forward and dove for the deck, heading for the German border 20 miles away. Wheeler did not hesitate. He rolled inverted, pulled through, and came up behind the fleeing bomber. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes, positioned on the other side. Wheeler radioed for confirmation. The controller, who had Webb on the line, gave authorization to fire. Wheeler and Hayes opened up with their .50 caliber machine guns from 200 yards, a range where they could not miss. Donnelly, watching from the ground, saw the tracers converge on the bomber. He saw hits on the wings, the fuselage, the engines. He saw number 3 engine start smoking. He saw the aircraft begin to lose altitude, and he experienced something that would haunt him for the next 60 years. He felt satisfaction. He felt pride. He had identified the threat. He had called it in. He had saved the hospital. But underneath that, buried deep, was the sick knowledge that he had just killed men who looked like they were on his side. And even though they were not, even though they were Germans in American clothing, the shape of the aircraft and the markings on the wings created a cognitive dissonance that his brain could not fully resolve. Stardust, mortally wounded, tried to reach German territory. Dieter fought the controls. Richter tried to extinguish the engine fires. Muller was calculating whether they could make it. Schmidt was preparing to destroy the documents and equipment that would prove they were spies. Hoffmann was sending a final radio message to German controllers, giving their position, asking for help that could not arrive in time. They were 3 miles from the border when No. 3 engine tore itself off the wing and the B-17 rolled inverted and went into a spin and hit the ground at 300 miles per hour in an open field. There were no survivors. The impact was so violent that the largest piece of wreckage was the tail section, and the rest was scattered across 2 acres of farmland. American investigators arrived within hours. They found German uniforms in the wreckage, German identification papers, German maps, radio equipment tuned to Luftwaffe frequencies, documents in German, and they found the bombs, American bombs, that had been loaded at a German airfield meant for an American hospital. The story was classified immediately. The 8th Air Force Command made a decision that this information would not be widely distributed because the psychological impact on American aircrews would be devastating. If men knew that German aircraft could infiltrate their formations, they would start suspecting every B-17 around them. They would start seeing enemies in their friends. The trust that held the formations together would dissolve. Better to keep it secret, better to let it die with the crew of Stardust, but secrets have a way of leaking. Within days, rumors were spreading through the bomb groups. A German B-17 had been shot down. The Germans had been flying with American formations. The enemy was among them. Morale plummeted. Crews started reporting suspicious aircraft that turned out to be genuine American bombers with unusual markings or damage. Friendly fire incidents increased. The paranoia that the Germans had hoped to create was taking root, even though Stardust was destroyed. The 8th Air Force leadership had to act. They issued a directive clarifying identification procedures. They changed recognition codes more frequently. They implemented new challenge and response protocols. And, slowly, over several weeks, the paranoia faded. KG-200, having lost their prize aircraft and their trained crew, attempted to continue the program with other captured B-17s. But the Americans were now alert to the possibility, and the Germans could never again achieve the level of success they had with Stardust. The program was quietly abandoned in May of 1944. The few remaining captured bombers were relegated to testing and training roles. The psychological warfare experiment had failed, not because it could not work, but because it had worked too well and provoked a response that made continuation impossible. Michael Donnelly received a commendation for his actions in identifying Stardust. He did not want it. He tried to refuse it. He told his commanding officer that he did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had participated in something morally complicated and deeply disturbing, but the commendation was entered into his record anyway, and he was sent back to his unit, and he flew 23 more missions before the war ended. After the war, he went home to Pittsburgh and worked in a steel mill and never talked about Stardust with anyone except his wife. Once, on their 50th anniversary, when she asked him why, he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night and stared at the ceiling. He told her about the B-17 with American markings and German bombs. He told her about the moment he realized what he was looking at. He told her about the tracers converging on the aircraft and the satisfaction he felt and the shame that came after. She held his hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. James Patrick Sullivan, the pilot of the original Irish Luck, survived the war in Stalag Luft 3. He participated in the Great Escape in March 1944, though he was not one of the 50 who were recaptured and executed. He was liberated in May 1945 and returned home to Boston and married his high school sweetheart and worked as a commercial pilot for TWA. He never learned that his aircraft had been repaired and used by the Germans until 1973, when a historian researching KG-200 contacted him with documents showing that the B-17 with serial number 4-2-3-1785 had been recovered and converted into stardust. Sullivan's first reaction was anger. His second was a strange kind of pride that his aircraft had been good enough that the Germans wanted to use it. His third reaction, which lasted the rest of his life, was a deep sadness for the men on both sides who had died because of one airplane that had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The wreckage of Stardust was bulldozed into a pit and buried in 1946. No one marked the site. No one remembered exactly where it was. The field was returned to agricultural use, and for 70 years it grew wheat and barley and corn, and occasionally a farmer would turn up a piece of twisted metal with his plow and would wonder what it was and would throw it aside and forget about it. In 2016, a metal detector enthusiast found a piece of aluminum in that field with a stenciled serial number barely visible under decades of corrosion. He photographed it and posted it online, asking if anyone could identify it. A military historian recognized the number as matching a B-17 and began investigating. He found the German records of KG-200. He found the American intelligence reports about Stardust. He found Webb's investigation and Donnelly's commendation. He pieced together the whole story. In 2018, a team of archaeologists received permission to excavate the site. They found fragments of 4 engines. They found pieces of the airframe with both American and German markings visible in layers of paint. They found personal effects from the German crew. They found bomb sites and radios and guns and all the mechanical debris of war. And they found human remains. 5 men, burned and broken, who had been buried in the wreckage for 72 years. The remains were identified through dental records and personal effects as the crew of Stardust. The German government requested their return. The archaeologists complied. The 5 men were buried in a military cemetery in Germany with full honors, and the ceremony was attended by descendants of both the German crew and the American crews who had been targeted by Stardust. At that ceremony, a grandson of Klaus Dieter met a grandson of Michael Donnelly. They shook hands. They did not speak for several minutes because what was there to say? Finally, Dieter's grandson said, "My grandfather should not have done what he did." And Donnelly's grandson said, "My grandfather did what he had to do." And that was enough. That was all the reconciliation that history would allow. The fragments of Stardust are now in a museum in Germany, displayed alongside fragments of German aircraft that were shot down by American gunners. All of them pieces of machines that carried young men to their deaths. The exhibit is titled The Thin Line, and it explores the moral complexities of deception in warfare. It asks questions that have no good answers. Was it legitimate for the Germans to use captured aircraft against their enemies? Was it a war crime or just a clever tactic? Were the crew of Stardust soldiers or spies? Did they deserve to be shot down or did they deserve to make it home? The exhibit does not provide answers because there are no answers, only the facts of what happened and the understanding that war creates situations where every choice is bad, and the best you can hope for is to choose the least bad option and live with the consequences. The story of Stardust is not a story about heroes or villains. It is a story about the machinery of war and the men who operate it. It is about the thin line between legitimate military action and moral transgression. It is about trust and betrayal and the sick feeling in your stomach when you realize that the enemy has learned to look like a friend. And it is about the silence that falls over men when they have to kill their brothers, even when those brothers are wearing the wrong uniform and carrying the wrong bombs. That silence, that hollow ringing in the ears, that is the sound of a moral wound that never fully heals. Michael Donnelly carried it to his grave in 2008. James Patrick Sullivan carried it to his grave in 2012. And somewhere in Germany, descendants of Klaus Dieter and Friedrich Hoffmann and Hans Müller and Otto Schmidt and Paul Richter carry it still, the knowledge that their grandfathers flew in American colors and dropped American bombs on American soldiers and died for it in a field 20 miles from home. The B-17 that fought for two nations, the bomber that betrayed its own, Stardust, formerly Irish Luck, serial number 42-31785. One aircraft, two identities, and the understanding that in war, nothing is ever as simple as friend or enemy, and the machines we build can be turned against us by men desperate enough to try.